The mud in Prosperity's main street was a cold, greedy thing, sucking at the boots of the men gathered in a loose, cruel circle. It was the kind of cold that went straight to the bone, a damp, miserable chill that promised a bitter winter. Caleb stood apart from them, his worn coat pulled tight, his face a mask of indifference carved by years of practice. He was a ghost in their midst, a necessary evil they tolerated for his skill with the gun holstered low on his hip. He'd come for salt and flour, not for a spectacle, but Mayor Vance had a way of creating them. The mayor stood on the steps of the land office, his belly straining the buttons of his waistcoat, a smug, porcine grin on his face. Beside him, held by the arm by one of Vance's lumbering deputies, was a girl. She was impossibly small against the vast gray sky, swallowed by the drab browns and grays of the town. Her only color was the faded, dirty red of her strange dress, a garment that clung to her slender frame, utterly alien and out of place. She was Chinese, a porcelain doll dropped in the mire. The crowd jeered and snickered, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Caleb felt a familiar deadness settle over him. This was what men did when they were bored and cruel. "Caleb," Vance boomed, his voice oozing false bonhomie. "We all know you're a lonely man out there in that shack of yours. A man with particular needs. And Prosperity is a generous town." Laughter, sharp and ugly, rippled through the onlookers. The girl, May, did not flinch. Her eyes, dark and deep, scanned the crowd with a stillness that was more unsettling than fear. "The railroad left behind some cargo," Vance continued, gesturing grandly. "And as a gesture of goodwill, for all your fine work keeping the undesirables out, the town council and I have decided to gift her to you. A wife to warm your bed." He shoved her forward. She stumbled but caught her balance, her chin held high. She was an object, a stray dog, a joke. Caleb's first instinct was to turn and walk away, to leave the girl to whatever fate awaited her. It was not his business. Nothing was his business anymore. He started to shift his weight, to push back through the crowd, but then she looked at him. Her gaze wasn't pleading or terrified. It was direct, intelligent, and piercing. The deputy gave her a final push, sending her sprawling into the mud at Caleb's feet. The crowd roared. Caleb stared down at the splash of red against the brown earth, his gut tightening. He didn't move. He wouldn't. But as the laughter began to die down, a voice, clear and without a trace of an accent, cut through the cold air. "They say you have no soul." He froze. Every man in that circle froze. The words were not for them, but for him. He looked down. The girl, May, was pushing herself up, her eyes locked on his. She spoke again, her voice quiet but carrying with the weight of a judge's sentence. "Is that true?" The silence that fell over the market square was absolute, heavier than the winter sky. The men's leering grins faltered, replaced by slack-jawed confusion. Mayor Vance's face purpled, his joke curdling in the space between them. Caleb felt a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. Shock. It was a physical jolt, like a current running up his spine. He had expected tears, a foreign tongue, or the mute terror of an animal. He had not expected perfect crystalline English, nor a question that sliced straight through his armor to the hollow space where his heart used to be. He stared at her, this girl covered in mud, her fine black hair coming loose from its bindings, and saw not a victim, but a challenge. He saw a mind at work behind those dark, assessing eyes. Without a word, he reached down, his calloused hand closing around her thin arm, and pulled her to her feet. She was lighter than a sack of flour, yet her presence felt immense. He turned his back on the mayor and the gaping crowd and began to walk. He didn't look back. He could feel their stares, could almost hear the gears turning in their simple, brutish minds as they tried to comprehend what had just happened. The walk to his shack on the edge of town was silent. The girl, May, kept pace with him, her steps small but determined. He didn't offer his arm, and she didn't seek it. They were two separate islands of silence moving through a hostile sea. His shack was not a home, it was a shelter. 4 walls, a roof that mostly held, a stone hearth, a cot, and a table. It smelled of stale wood smoke, whiskey, and loneliness. It was the physical manifestation of the emptiness he carried inside him. He pushed the door open and stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. She paused on the threshold, her eyes taking in the Spartan, grim interior. He saw it through her eyes for a moment. The unwashed tin plate on the table, the pile of dirty blankets on the floor that served as a second bed, the dust motes dancing in the single beam of weak sunlight from the grimy window. It was a place a man came to wither away. She stepped inside without a word. Caleb closed the door, plunging the room into shadow. The finality of the sound echoed in the small space. He had brought the world's troubles into his sanctuary of numbness. He didn't know her name. He didn't want to. He pointed to the pile of blankets. "There," he grunted, the first word he'd spoken to her. He expected her to curl up and weep, to finally break. Instead, she simply nodded, her gaze sweeping over the room once more before she walked to the corner and sat, pulling the top blanket around her shoulders. She didn't look at him again. She just sat, a small, still figure in the gloom, leaving him to grapple with the disquiet she had brought into his carefully constructed void. For 3 days, a tense, suffocating silence filled the small cabin. Caleb fell back into his routine, a rhythm of survival he had honed to perfection. He rose before the sun, checked his traps, chopped wood, and cleaned his gun. He moved with a grim efficiency, trying to ignore the silent presence in the corner of his eye. He ate his meals of hardtack and salted meat standing by the hearth, acutely aware of her watching him. He had left a portion of his meager food on the table for her the first morning, and when he returned, it was gone. They existed in the same space, but in different worlds, orbiting each other like two celestial bodies bound by a strange, unwelcome gravity. He had assumed she would be a burden, a crying, helpless thing, but May was none of those. She was a ghost of quiet industry. On the second day, while he was outside splitting logs, he returned to find she had found a worn-out broom and swept the packed earth floor, gathering years of dust and grime into a neat pile by the door. On the third day, she took one of his threadbare shirts, tore it into strips, and using water from the bucket he hauled, began to wipe down the single grimy window pane. The act was so simple, so domestic, it felt like a violation. Light, clean, and sharp sliced into the shack's gloom, illuminating the squalor he had long since stopped seeing. It made him deeply uncomfortable. Her movements were graceful and economical, imbued with a purpose that his own actions lacked. He was merely surviving. She was reclaiming. She was imposing order on his chaos, cleanliness on his filth. Each swept corner, each wiped surface, was a silent accusation against the life he had let himself live. He found himself watching her, the way her slender fingers worked to mend a tear in one of the blankets with a piece of twine, the focused set of her jaw as she scrubbed a pot with sand and water until it dully gleamed. She never spoke, not since that first day in the town square. Her silence was now as unnerving as her words had been. It was a patient silence, a waiting silence. It made him feel like he was the one being evaluated. One evening, he sat cleaning his revolver, the familiar, methodical clicks of the cylinder a small comfort. He glanced up and saw her looking at the weapon, her expression unreadable. He felt a sudden, sharp need to explain, to justify the piece of metal that defined him. But what could he say? "This is what I am. This is all I am." He said nothing, snapping the gun back together with more force than necessary. She looked away, her attention returning to the small fire in the hearth, leaving him feeling strangely judged and found wanting. Her quiet dignity was a mirror, and he did not like the reflection he saw. The larder was nearly empty. A trip to town was unavoidable. The thought of it coiled in Caleb's stomach like a cold snake. Before, he had moved through prosperity as a phantom, ignored and feared in equal measure. Now he would be a spectacle, the man with the Chinese wife. He pulled on his coat, the worn wool a familiar weight on his shoulders. He expected May to remain in the shack, a secret hidden away. But as he reached for the door, she stood up. She had washed her red dress in the creek, and though it was still faded, the color was a defiant slash against the bleakness of the cabin. She had braided her hair neatly. She was ready. "Stay here," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She met his gaze, and for the first time since that day in the market, she spoke. "They will think you are ashamed of me." Her logic was a sharp, clean blow. He was not ashamed of her, he realized. He was ashamed of himself, of the town, of the whole sordid affair. But her words were true. Hiding her would be an admission of guilt, an acceptance of Vance's cruel terms. It would make her a dirty secret. He gave a short, frustrated sigh and jerked his head toward the door. "Fine, but stay close." The walk into town was a trial. Every window seemed to hold a pair of watching eyes. Every whisper on the wind felt like it was shaping his name. May walked beside him, not behind, her posture erect, her gaze fixed forward. She did not shrink from the stares or the muttered comments that followed them like a cloud of flies. Her resilience was a strange comfort, a small, solid thing to anchor himself to in the sea of their contempt. At Seraphina's mercantile, the air was warm and smelled of cinnamon and coffee beans. Seraphina, a widow with kind eyes and a spine of steel, was the closest thing prosperity had to a conscience. She nodded at Caleb as he entered, then her eyes moved to May. There was no pity in her look, only a quiet, womanly appraisal. "Caleb," she said, her voice even, "good morning." Caleb grunted a reply, moving towards the barrels of flour and beans. He was aware of May standing by the counter, her fingers ghosting over a bolt of blue calico fabric. He filled his sacks with the usual, flour, salt, coffee, bacon. But then he hesitated. He found himself adding a bar of lye soap, a small bone-handled comb, and a spool of black thread to his pile. He didn't know why. The purchases felt intimate, an acknowledgment of her as a person, a woman, in his house. He paid his tally, and as he turned to leave, Seraphina spoke directly to May. "That's a lovely color on you," she said, nodding toward the red dress. May looked startled, then a small, hesitant smile touched her lips. "Thank you." Outside, the air felt colder. As they walked back, Caleb handed her the small parcel with the soap and comb, his movements stiff and awkward. She took it without a word, but he saw the look in her eyes. It was not gratitude. It was something more complex, something that looked dangerously like understanding. A week later, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise and the world disappeared behind a wall of swirling snow. The blizzard descended without warning, a howling white fury that imprisoned them in the small cabin. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the door in its frame and driving fine powder through the cracks in the walls. For 2 days they were marooned, the world shrinking to the 4 walls of the shack and the flickering light of the fire. The forced proximity was a crucible. The silence, once a buffer, now felt thin and stretched, charged with unspoken thoughts. They moved around each other in a careful choreography, the small space making every movement, every breath, an intrusion. Caleb found himself unable to settle. He paced, he stared into the fire, he dismantled and reassembled his pistol until the metal was warm from his hands. The storm outside mirrored the one raging inside him, whipping up memories he had long buried under a drift of whiskey and apathy. On the third night, sleep finally claimed him, but it offered no peace. He dreamt of another cabin, of fire and smoke, of a woman's scream and the name torn from his own throat. Ilara! He woke with a gasp, the name a raw wound in the quiet room. He was drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. The ghosts were so close he could almost feel their cold breath on his neck. A shadow moved in the darkness. May was there, standing a few feet from his cot. He expected to see fear or revulsion in her eyes, but the faint firelight showed only a deep, solemn calm. She held a tin cup of water, steam rising from it in a fragile ribbon. She didn't speak, just held it out to him. His hand trembled as he took it. The warmth seeped into his skin, a small, grounding comfort in the wreckage of his nightmare. He drank, the hot water soothing the rawness in his throat. He sat on the edge of the cot, his head in his hands, the dream clinging to him like a shroud. "You lost someone," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, spoken with a quiet certainty that left no room for denial. He couldn't bring himself to look at her, to let her see the utter devastation in his eyes. He just nodded, a single, jerky movement. The silence stretched, filled only by the howl of the wind. He thought she would leave him to his misery, retreat back to her corner. Instead, she sat on the small stool by the hearth. "I did too," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "When the railroad men came to my village, they promised work for my father and brother. They promised passage. They lied." She paused, her gaze distant, fixed on the dancing flames. "I lost everyone." In that moment, the space between them collapsed. The gunslinger haunted by his past and the girl stolen from her home were no longer just a man and a woman trapped by a storm. They were two survivors, two souls adrift in a sea of grief, who had, for a brief, fragile moment, found a shared shore. The wall inside him didn't crumble, but a single, vital stone had been dislodged. The blizzard broke on the 5th day, leaving behind a world remade in pristine, blinding white. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of melting snow from the eaves. But the peace was short-lived. Late in the afternoon, the crunch of hooves on snow announced visitors. Caleb looked out the window and his body went cold. Mayor Vance, flanked by 2 of his thuggish deputies, was riding towards the shack. Their dark figures were a blot on the clean landscape. Caleb's hand went instinctively to the Colt at his hip. He opened the door before they could knock, stepping out to meet them on the small patch of ground he'd cleared. He positioned himself squarely in front of the doorway, a human shield. Vance reined in his horse, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. He looked Caleb up and down, then let his gaze linger pointedly on the cabin door. "Just making my rounds, Caleb," the mayor said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Checking on the good folks of this county after the storm. And, of course," he paused for effect, "checking on my property." The word hung in the frigid air, an insult and a threat. Caleb's eyes narrowed. "She's not your property." The words were low and flat, each one a stone dropped into a frozen pond. One of the deputies, a burly man named Jedediah, shifted in his saddle, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. Vance's smirk widened. "Is that so? I seem to recall gifting her to you. A gift can be rescinded if it's not being properly appreciated." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial leer. "Or has she worn out her welcome? Perhaps you'd like to return her to the town's care. We could find another use for her." The implication was vile and unmistakable. A muscle twitched in Caleb's jaw. He saw a flash of May's face in his mind, the quiet dignity, the shared grief in her eyes. The protective instinct that rose in him was fierce and unfamiliar, a dormant part of him waking with a vengeance. He had spent years not caring about anyone or anything, but the thought of Vance putting his filthy hands on her, of seeing her spirit broken by men like these, was intolerable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone was colder than the snow at their feet. "You've checked. Now get off my land." Vance's face hardened. The pretense of civility was gone. "That's my decision to make. I'm coming inside." He made to dismount, but stopped when he saw the look in Caleb's eyes. It was the look he was famous for, the dead, flat calm that came before the explosion of violence. His hand hadn't moved, but the threat was as clear as if the gun were pointed at Vance's heart. "I won't say it again, Vance." For a long moment, no one moved. The deputies glanced nervously at their boss. They were bullies, not fighters, and they knew Caleb's reputation was not an exaggeration. Finally, with a snarled curse, Vance yanked his horse's reins. "This isn't over, Gunslinger. You've made a powerful enemy today." He spurred his horse, turning back towards town, his deputies trailing behind him like dogs. Caleb watched them go, his body rigid, until they were small specks in the distance. Only then did he allow himself to breathe, the cold air burning his lungs. He had drawn a line in the snow. He had chosen a side. And he knew, with a grim certainty, that the war had just begun. The story of Mayor Vance's visit spread through Prosperity like wildfire, carried on whispers and embellished with each telling. Caleb had defied the mayor. He had claimed the Chinese girl as his own. The town, which had once been united in its scorn, was now fractured. Some saw Caleb's defiance as an insult to the town's authority, a dangerous precedent set by a man they already distrusted. Others, however, saw it differently. They saw a powerful man bullying a broken one, and saw a flicker of something noble in Caleb's stand. A few days later, a figure on horseback approached the shack. Caleb's hand was on his gun until he recognized the rider. It was Arthur, a quiet, solitary rancher from the next valley over, a man who kept to himself as much as Caleb did. Arthur dismounted, untying a heavy, cloth-wrapped bundle from his saddle. "Heard you had some trouble with the mayor," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't wait for a response. "Figured you could use this." He held out the bundle. It was a large cut of venison. "Winter's been hard," was all he said before he nodded, mounted his horse, and rode away. It was an offering of solidarity, a quiet statement that Caleb was not entirely alone. The next day, Seraphina from the mercantile came herself. She drove a small buckboard right up to the cabin, a bold move that would not go unnoticed. She brought a crate of supplies, canned peaches, a sack of potatoes, and a thick wool shawl of a deep blue color. She handed the shawl directly to May, who had come to the doorway. "The nights are still cold," Seraphina said, her eyes kind. "A woman needs to stay warm." The gesture was more than charity. It was an act of recognition, one woman to another. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had undergone a profound shift. The confrontation with Vance had broken the last of the silence between them. Caleb found himself talking, telling May about the different types of trees, the habits of the deer that came to the creek. In return, she began to share pieces of her own world. She told him the names of constellations he had never heard of, stories of her village by a wide, slow-moving river. She taught him a few words in her language, the sounds soft and lyrical on her tongue. He learned that "xie" meant thank you, and "jia" meant home. He found himself saying the word "jia" over and over in his mind as he looked around the small cabin. It was a strange and foreign concept. This place had only ever been a shelter, a place to hide from the world. But now, with the smell of the venison stew she was cooking on the fire, with the blue shawl draped over the back of a chair, with her quiet, steady presence filling the space, it was beginning to feel like something more. They were forging a new identity, not as a gunslinger in his possession, but as two people building a small, defiant fortress of shared experience against the cold hostility of the world outside. The fragile peace was shattered 2 weeks later. Mayor Vance, stewing in his humiliation, was not a man to let a slight go unanswered. He couldn't challenge Caleb with guns, so he chose the weapon of a coward, the law. He fabricated a charge, accusing Caleb of stealing cattle from a neighboring ranch, a ranch owned by Vance's cousin. It was a flimsy pretext, but in a town run by Vance, it was enough. The warrant was sworn, and the trap was set. They came for him at midday, when he and May were in town for supplies. Jedediah and the other deputy, their faces grimly official, cornered him in front of the mercantile. "Caleb," Jedediah announced loudly for the benefit of the gathering crowd, "you're under arrest for cattle rustling." Caleb didn't react. He knew this was a sham, a public spectacle designed to break him. They wanted to drag him to the town jail, leaving May unprotected and vulnerable. His eyes flickered to her. She stood a few feet away, her face pale but her expression resolute. He expected her to run, to hide. He would have understood, but she didn't either. As the deputies moved to grab his arms, May stepped forward. She positioned herself not behind him, but beside him, facing the crowd of onlookers. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was filled with a clarity and strength that cut through every other sound. "This man is not a thief," she began, her perfect English stunning the crowd into silence for the second time. "This is about me." She looked directly at the faces in the crowd, the blacksmith, the ranchers, the women with their shopping baskets. "Mayor Vance gave me to him as a joke. He thought this man would treat me as property, as something less than human, to be used and discarded." Her gaze swept over them, implicating each and every one who had laughed that day. "But he did not. He has shown me respect. He has given me shelter and protection. And because he will not bow to the mayor's cruelty, because he sees me as a person, Mayor Vance seeks to destroy him." A murmur went through the crowd. Her words were a stone dropped in the stagnant water of their complacency. Then Seraphina stepped out from her shop, her arms crossed. "She's telling the truth," she declared, her voice ringing with authority. "I've seen it. Vance is a bully and a tyrant." Arthur, the rancher, who had been standing near the back, pushed his way forward. "Caleb's no rustler," he boomed, "and Vance's cousin hasn't had a cow go missing in 5 years. This is a disgrace." The tide was turning. The crowd, once a hostile mob, was now a group of individuals, their faces showing doubt, then shame, then a slow-burning anger. May had not just defended Caleb. She had held up a mirror to the entire town, and they were finally seeing the ugliness of their own reflection. The confrontation in the town square had reached a tipping point. The authority of Vance's deputies was dissolving in the face of public dissent. Jedediah looked uncertainly from the crowd to Caleb, his hand hovering near his pistol, but the conviction had gone out of his posture. He was a bully, not a martyr, and he had no desire to face down an entire town that was turning against him. Caleb hadn't moved a muscle. He didn't need to draw his gun. May's courage, Seraphina's integrity, and Arthur's simple honesty had proven to be far more powerful weapons. They had disarmed the mayor without a single shot being fired. From the doors of the saloon, 3 men emerged. They were the town councilmen, ranchers, and business owners who had long enabled Vance's corruption through their own apathy and self-interest. But they were also pragmatic men who could read the shifting winds. They saw the crowd, heard the anger, and understood that Vance had finally overplayed his hand. One of them, a stern-faced man named Sterling, who owned the feed store, strode to the center of the street. "Jedediah," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command, "stand down. There will be no arrests today." He turned his hard gaze on the deputies. "Go back and tell Mayor Vance the town council wishes to have a word with him, immediately." The deputies, visibly relieved to be given an out, holstered their weapons and beat a hasty retreat, their authority vanishing with them. The crowd began to talk amongst themselves, the tension breaking, replaced by a current of shared purpose. Sterling walked over to Caleb and May. He looked at Caleb, then his gaze settled on May with a newfound respect. "It seems we owe you both an apology," he said, the words costing him some effort. "We've been blind for too long." Caleb merely nodded, his eyes finding May's. He saw the tremor in her hands, the delayed reaction to the immense bravery she had shown. He felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to shield her from the world that had demanded so much of her. He gently took her arm, his touch a silent message of support and profound gratitude. Without another word to the councilman or the crowd, they turned and began the walk back to their shack. The journey felt different this time. The stares that followed them were no longer filled with scorn or pity, but with a grudging admiration. They walked not as a pariah in his strange possession, but as two people who had faced down injustice and won. The air was still cold, but for the first time, Caleb felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a thawing in a land that had been frozen for far too long. They had found their footing, together, on the hard, unforgiving ground of this town. 1 year later, the world was green again. Spring had come to the valley with a gentle persistence, coaxing new leaves from the cottonwoods and painting the hillsides with the bold colors of wildflowers. The shack on the edge of town was transformed. It was no longer a grim shelter, but a home. Caleb had added a small porch to the front, and its raw pine planks were already silvering in the sun. Lace curtains, a gift from Seraphina, hung in the now spotless window, and a sturdy new door had replaced the old rickety one. But the biggest change was the garden. Beside the cabin, where once there had been only hard-packed dirt and stubborn weeds, was a thriving plot of land. May had worked it with a patient determination, turning the soil, planting seeds she'd carefully procured. Rows of beans, squash, and herbs now grew in neat, verdant lines. It was a testament to her belief in the future, a splash of life and hope against the rugged landscape. Caleb was mending a section of fence, his movements easy and practiced. The haunted, hollowed-out look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment. The harsh lines on his face had softened. He still wore his gun, but it felt less like a part of him and more like a tool, one he hoped he would not have to use again. The town of Prosperity had changed too. Mayor Vance was gone, having left in disgrace after the council stripped him of his power. The town was quieter now, more decent. People nodded to Caleb on the street. They called him by his name. He was no longer the gunslinger. He was their neighbor. May came out of the cabin carrying a dipper of cool water from the well. She wore a simple dress of blue calico and her hair was tied back with a ribbon. She moved with a grace and confidence that seemed to radiate from her. She handed him the dipper and their fingers brushed. The small touch sent a familiar warmth through him. "The fence is strong," she said, smiling. He drank deeply, the water clean and cold. "Needs to be," he replied, his own smile coming easily, "to keep the deer out of your garden." They spoke in a comfortable mix of English and the Chinese words she had taught him, their two languages weaving together to create a private dialect of their own. She looked at the green shoots pushing up from the dark earth. "Everything grows," she said softly, "if you give it a chance." He looked at her, at the home they had built, at the life they were forging from the ashes of their pasts. He understood. He had been a barren patch of ground, and she had been the one who had patiently tended it, believing something could grow there. He reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. It felt right. It felt like coming home. Together they stood and looked out over the valley, not as two broken survivors, but as two people who had found in each other the strength to plant roots and bloom in the most unlikely of places.